In the dense wilderness of Maine's Appalachian Trail, a grandmother's simple hiking mistake became one of the most haunting disappearances in American outdoor history. What searchers eventually discovered would challenge everything they thought they knew about survival, human endurance, and the strange forces that seem to govern the deep woods. Before we start, hit subscribe to stay connected with mysterious discoveries. It was July 15th, 2013, in the rugged mountains of western Maine, where the Appalachian Trail cuts through some of the most unforgiving wilderness on the eastern seaboard. Geraldine Largay, a 66-year-old grandmother from Tennessee, had been hiking northbound with her husband George as part of their dream to complete the entire 2,100-mile trail. What began as a retirement adventure would become a case that defied every assumption about lost hikers and woodland survival. The morning had started routinely enough near Poplar Ridge, where the trail winds through dense stands of spruce and fir that block out most sunlight even at midday. George had left earlier to meet friends, planning to rejoin his wife Geraldine at a predetermined point further north. She continued alone, carrying her pack, and what searchers would later discover was an unusual amount of determination for someone facing the Maine wilderness. At approximately 10:30 that morning, Geraldine stepped off the marked trail to relieve herself, a decision that millions of hikers make without consequence. The forest here grows thick and disorienting, with identical-looking trees stretching in every direction and no clear landmarks to guide the way back. When she attempted to return to the trail, the path had simply vanished, swallowed by the endless repetition of trunk and shadow that characterizes Maine's deep woods. What happened next challenges conventional understanding of how lost hikers behave and survive. Rather than panic or make the fatal mistake of wandering further into the wilderness, Geraldine demonstrated an almost supernatural level of composure. She found a small clearing roughly 2,600 feet from the trail and made the decision to stay put, following the standard advice given to lost hikers everywhere. The search began within hours of her failure to appear at the designated meeting point. Maine game wardens, volunteer search teams, and specialized tracking units combed the area with dogs, helicopters, and thermal imaging equipment. The operation grew into one of the largest search efforts in Maine's history, involving hundreds of volunteers and sophisticated technology that should have located any living person within miles. Yet, the forest seemed to have absorbed Geraldine completely. Search dogs lost her scent within yards of where she had left the trail. Helicopters equipped with heat-sensing cameras detected nothing unusual in the dense canopy below. Ground teams walked within yards of her location multiple times, their calls echoing through the trees without response. What makes this case particularly disturbing is what investigators discovered about Geraldine's survival strategy. She had established a small camp in her clearing, creating shelter from her hiking gear and rationing her limited food supplies with mathematical precision. More unsettling still, she had begun keeping a detailed journal of her experience, documenting not just her physical condition, but strange observations about the forest around her. The journal entries, later recovered by authorities, reveal a woman maintaining remarkable mental clarity while slowly starving in the wilderness. She wrote about the sounds of the forest changing at night, describing calls and movements that didn't match any known wildlife in the region. She documented the way shadows seemed to shift and move independently of the sun's position, creating patterns that her rational mind couldn't explain. On July 22nd, 7 days after becoming lost, Geraldine managed to send a text message to her husband using her cell phone. The message was brief and matter-of-fact, explaining that she had gotten off the trail and was lost. What cellular engineers later found impossible to explain was how the message had transmitted at all from her location, which showed no cell tower coverage and was surrounded by terrain that should have blocked any signal. The text message provided searchers with GPS coordinates, but when teams arrived at the specified location, they found nothing. The coordinates pointed to a section of forest that multiple search parties had already covered thoroughly. Some searchers reported an unusual silence in that area, as if the normal sounds of birds and insects had been completely suppressed. Geraldine continued writing in her journal for weeks after her last known contact with the outside world. Her entries describe a gradual weakening of her body, but also an increasing awareness of what she termed the watchers in the forest. She wrote about shapes moving just beyond her vision, always staying in her peripheral sight, but vanishing whenever she turned to look directly. The journal documents her attempts to signal for help, including building signal fires that produce smoke but somehow never seemed to rise above the canopy. She described laying out bright clothing in patterns that should have been visible from aircraft, only to find them rearranged in different configurations the following morning. Most disturbing of all, she wrote about hearing her own voice calling from different directions in the forest, as if something was using her voice to confuse potential rescuers. As weeks passed, Geraldine's journal entries became increasingly focused on the strange behavior of the forest itself. She documented trees that seemed to change position slightly between day and night, creating an ever-shifting maze that made navigation impossible. She wrote about finding small clearings that hadn't been there the previous day and paths that appeared to lead toward the main trail but invariably curved back on themselves. The search continued for weeks, then months, with volunteers refusing to give up hope. The case attracted national attention, with experienced outdoorsmen and survival experts expressing bewilderment at how someone could simply vanish so completely in a relatively small area. Some searchers reported equipment malfunctions while working in the vicinity of where Geraldine was believed to be located, with compasses spinning wildly and GPS units providing impossible readings. Local residents, many of whom had lived in the area for generations, began sharing stories that had been passed down through their families. They spoke of sections of the forest where people had disappeared before, always in the same general area where Geraldine had gone missing. Native American tribal histories, when consulted, contained references to places where the boundary between the physical world and something else had grown thin. The final journal entry, dated more than a month after Geraldine had become lost, describes her acceptance of what she had come to believe was happening to her. She wrote about feeling as though she existed in a space that was somehow adjacent to the normal world, able to see and hear search parties, but unable to make contact with them. She described watching searchers walk through her camp as if she and her belongings were invisible to them. When Geraldine's remains were finally discovered 2 years later, in October of 2015, the location was less than 3,000 feet from the Appalachian Trail. The discovery site was in an area that had been searched multiple times by different teams using various methods. Her campsite was exactly as she had described it in her journal, with her gear arranged in a neat, organized fashion that suggested someone maintaining hope for rescue until the very end. The condition of the campsite raised questions that investigators have never been able to answer satisfactorily. Her journal, exposed to 2 Maine winters, remained perfectly legible as if it had been protected by some unknown force. Her clothing and equipment showed minimal weather damage despite being exposed to the elements for more than 2 years. Most puzzling of all, the vegetation around her campsite had grown in unnatural patterns, forming geometric shapes that had no explanation in normal forest ecology. The final mystery emerged when investigators attempted to understand why Geraldine had never been found during the original search. Using her journal entries and the GPS coordinates from her text message, they reconstructed the search efforts with precise accuracy. Multiple teams had walked within yards of her location, and in several cases, directly through her campsite. The journal confirms that she had seen and heard these searchers, had called out to them, and had even thrown objects in their direction. What do you think prevented dozens of experienced searchers from finding Geraldine Largay when she was so close to the trail and actively trying to signal for help? Share your thoughts on this deeply unsettling case and subscribe to explore more mysteries that challenge our understanding of reality itself.